For years, every maid hired by the cold billionaire failed to reach his withdrawn son. The boy refused to eat, to play, or to speak with anyone. His father, convinced that nothing could ever change, watched dozens of attempts end in quiet disappointment. But one day, a new maid with no formal education and a heart full of scars managed to do the impossible. She broke through the silence. And in the middle of an ordinary meal, the boy finally opened his mouth, looked up, and said a single innocent sentence that no one in that mansion expected. That sentence didn't just make him smile for the first time in years. It left his billionaire father speechless. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us below where you are watching from. Richard Whitmore sat alone in his grand estate, the wide marble halls echoing faintly with every step he took. Since the death of his wife, Amelia, the house had become a shell, elegant but lifeless. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Clean floors, polished railings, flawless paintings lined across the walls. Yet inside it was hollow, stripped of laughter, stripped of warmth. Richard lived with his 6-year-old son Noah, who had been diagnosed with mild autism. Noah was verbal but barely social. He struggled to connect, to share, to trust. Most days he followed a strict routine Richard designed himself. There was no time for play, no place for affection, only structure. Richard believed discipline was love and control was safety. He convinced himself that emotion led only to pain, and so he buried his. Each morning in the Whitmore Estate began the same way. Curtains drawn open by staff at precisely 7 a.m. Breakfast served without a word. Lessons scheduled down to the minute, and bedtime enforced by silence. There were no surprises, no laughter, just the sound of clocks ticking in empty rooms. Richard's world revolved around meetings, phone calls, and deadlines. He built his empire from the ground up, yet couldn't build a connection with the one person who needed him most. He loved Noah deeply, but love to him meant stability. Not smiles, not hugs, just making sure nothing broke. When Amelia died, something inside him froze. He convinced himself that if everything stayed under control, nothing else could fall apart. But that control came at a cost. The house grew quieter with each passing day, until silence itself became its language. Noah rarely left his room except for lessons or meals. He had toys, expensive ones, but they sat untouched. He had books, beautifully bound, but no one read to him. He had everything except what mattered. He would sit by the window for hours, lining up his toy cars in perfect rows, staring into the garden beyond the glass, but never stepping into it. His world was made of repetition, not joy. The west garden outside was lush and green, but he was rarely allowed to play freely there. Everything in the estate was monitored. Security cameras in the halls, alarms on the doors, staff trained to maintain silence and order. The air itself felt supervised. Richard didn't trust the world outside his gates, so he built walls so high that even love couldn't climb them. The employees followed rules, not feelings. They spoke only when necessary. They served meals without conversation. No one dared to comfort Noah or even smile too warmly at him. Richard made sure of it. And so, one by one, they left. Every maid, every nanny, every caretaker. No one lasted long enough to become familiar to the boy. Noah learned early that kindness wasn't expected here. His voice became softer, his presence smaller. He stopped asking for things. The mansion, with all its chandeliers and portraits, was nothing more than a polished cage. Richard wasn't cruel, just broken in ways he couldn't name. Losing Amelia had shattered the part of him that understood softness. Before her death, he had laughed sometimes. He had played piano in the evenings while she hummed along, and Noah would dance clumsily in the background. But the night she passed, everything ended. He blamed himself for not saving her, and from that day on, emotions became enemies. Grief turned into work. Pain turned into silence. He thought his discipline was protection, but it was really distance. He believed that keeping Noah busy would keep him safe, but all it did was make the boy invisible. And though Richard never said it aloud, he felt the emptiness too. Sometimes, late at night, he stood outside Noah's bedroom door, listening. He wanted to open it, to go inside, to say something, anything. But fear stopped him. What if he didn't know how? What if love wasn't enough? Every night he turned away. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hallway like regret made visible. The mansion's silence was no longer peace. It was punishment for both of them. Despite the stillness, something unseen was beginning to shift. Beneath the marble, beneath the routines, beneath the loneliness, change was coming. Noah was growing older, beginning to sense the absence that had defined his short life. He didn't understand it fully, but he felt it. That heaviness, that space where laughter should be. And Richard, though he didn't realize it, was reaching a breaking point too. The silence that once felt like safety now pressed on him like a weight he couldn't lift. The emptiness was too loud, too sharp, too real. All it would take to break that silence was one small moment, one act of kindness, one person brave enough to care. The world outside had already begun moving toward them, and on a grey Tuesday morning, the Whitmore Estate would open its iron gates to a woman who had no idea she was about to change everything. Sophia Hale arrived at the Whitmore Estate on a grey Tuesday morning, her worn suitcase trembling slightly in her hand. The sky hung low and colourless, the air thick with the kind of stillness that always came before change. The gates loomed tall before her, black, cold and unwelcoming. Beyond them the mansion stood in perfect silence, its windows gleaming like eyes that had forgotten how to see warmth. The agency had pushed hard to get her this job, despite her limited background and the fact that she didn't quite fit the kind of staff Richard Whitmore usually hired. Sophia wasn't polished. She didn't have references from wealthy employers. But she had something else, endurance. She had survived things no resume could capture. As a child, she had dropped out of school to care for her younger siblings, while her mother worked endless hours cleaning homes for others. Her father had disappeared long before that, leaving only debts and broken promises behind. She grew up in a small apartment in the rough side of New Haven, where lights flickered, and dinner often meant a single loaf of bread split 5 ways. But even then, Sophia had learned something precious, how to find light in dark places. Now, standing before the gates of the Whitmore Estate, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "It's just another house, Sophia. You've seen worse." When the gates opened with a heavy metallic groan, she walked through slowly, her footsteps echoing against the stone driveway. The mansion's tall glass doors opened before she could knock. A woman in a pressed uniform from the agency greeted her without a smile. "You'll take care of the West Wing," she said sharply. "Do not enter the study room. Do not speak to the child. And above all, keep quiet." Sophia nodded, though something about those rules unsettled her. She had worked in homes with children before. They usually brought life to the place. But here the silence felt thick, unnatural. Even the staff avoided eye contact, moving through hallways like ghosts performing their duties. Her room was small, tucked behind the laundry corridor. Bare walls, a single bed, a cracked mirror. But to Sophia it was enough. She placed her suitcase neatly on the floor, changed into her plain uniform, and began working right away. She dusted shelves that were already spotless, wiped mirrors that reflected loneliness more than light, and polished furniture that looked too perfect to ever be used. Each task was mechanical, rehearsed, empty. But Sophia wasn't the kind to rush through a job. She noticed details, the way the air smelled faintly of lemon and loss, the faint hum of security cameras hidden in the corners, the way the curtains moved just slightly even when the windows were closed. That afternoon, while carrying a basket of folded towels through the hallway, Sophia noticed something. Movement. A small figure stood near one of the doors at the end of the corridor. A boy, thin and pale, with soft brown hair falling messily over his forehead. He didn't look up. His hands were busy twisting a toy car between his fingers, lost in quiet concentration. Sophia froze for a moment, unsure if she was even allowed to look. But curiosity softened her fear. She studied him from afar, his stillness, the delicate way his fingers moved, the absence of expression on his small face. When he finally lifted his gaze, her breath caught. There was no fear in his eyes, but no joy either, just emptiness, like someone who had been staring at the same wall for too long. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stood there, towel basket in hand, as something passed silently between them. Not a word, not a gesture, but an understanding, an invisible thread forming quietly between two people who carried different kinds of loneliness. She walked away, her heart heavier than before. Sophia continued her work quietly in the days that followed, always following the rules, always keeping her head down. But she couldn't forget that little boy's eyes. They stayed in her mind at night when she tried to sleep, and in the mornings when she polished the long dining table that no one ever seemed to use. Eventually, whispers from the other maids filled in the blanks. The boy's name was Noah Whitmore, the billionaire's son. No one spoke to him, and no one dared to question why. One older maid leaned close and said in a hushed tone, "Don't get involved. The master doesn't like questions. He wants order, not kindness." Sophia only nodded, but something in her chest resisted that rule. She had spent most of her life caring for people, siblings, neighbors, even strangers. It was instinct now, and though she tried to stay invisible, her thoughts kept drifting toward that lonely child. Sometimes she'd pass by the hallway hoping to see him again. She wasn't trying to break the rules. She just couldn't ignore the small ache she felt when she imagined him sitting alone in those empty rooms. He reminded her of her younger brother, the one who used to wait for their mother to come home, hungry but quiet, too patient for a child his age. That same quiet pain now lived in Noah's eyes. Sophia didn't pity him. She felt something deeper, a pull, a quiet resolve. She didn't know what she could do yet, but she knew one thing: pretending not to care wasn't possible anymore. Even if the rules said she couldn't speak to him, her heart had already spoken for her. One afternoon, while cleaning near the family lounge, Sophia heard a faint thud. She turned quickly and saw Noah sitting on the floor, his toy blocks scattered. He didn't cry. He just stared at one block, frozen, as if deciding whether to pick it up or let it go. Sophia hesitated, then walked toward him slowly. She knelt down, picked up the block, and placed it gently in his hand. No words, just a quiet offering. For a moment he looked up at her. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Then she stood, turned away, and returned to her work. But her heart didn't. It stayed there on that carpet beside him. That evening, while folding sheets in the laundry room, she caught herself smiling faintly. It was nothing, a simple exchange. But in this house of silence, that tiny moment had meant everything. Sophia didn't feel fear anymore, only a quiet determination, the kind that lives deep in the chest and grows when you least expect it. She didn't know how or when, but something inside her whispered that this house would never be the same again. The memory of that small, wordless encounter stayed with Sophia. Every time she walked down the marble halls, her eyes drifted toward corners where she thought Noah might appear. She never sought him directly, but she was always aware of his presence, like sunlight filtered through clouds. Days passed in the same rigid pattern the mansion demanded. The clocks chimed, the staff whispered, and silence ruled everything. Yet under that stillness, Sophia felt something fragile beginning to stir. She learned more about the family from quiet gossip traded in the laundry room. Mr. Whitmore rarely spoke to anyone outside of work. His wife, Amelia, had passed away years ago, and since then he had become even more withdrawn. The staff said the mansion was frozen in time, preserved exactly as she had left it. "He can't let go," one of the cooks whispered. "He's still living inside her shadow." Sophia didn't reply, but she understood. Grief doesn't just bury the dead. it buries the living. 2. Each day she went about her chores. But she started to notice things she hadn't before. The half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, the untouched piano gathering dust in the corner of the study, the way Noah's tiny shoes were always neatly aligned by the door, like a boy who followed invisible orders. One afternoon, while she was cleaning the long hallway that led to the study, she saw him again. Noah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, quietly aligning his toy cars in a perfect line. His expression was calm, almost empty, but his focus was absolute. Sophia stopped mid-step. She wanted to say something, but the memory of the agency's warning echoed in her mind. Do not speak to the child. So she didn't. She just watched, quietly. Then, as if sensing her gaze, Noah looked up. For a second, the silence between them changed. It wasn't just absence anymore. It was awareness. Sophia smiled just slightly. It wasn't a full smile, just enough to let him know she saw him, that he wasn't invisible. He didn't smile back. But he didn't look away either. That small connection, no words, no rules broken, felt like something real. And when she walked away, her chest felt warmer than before. Over the next few days, their quiet encounters continued. Sometimes she would find him sitting near the large window, watching the rain fall across the west garden. Other times, she'd spot him standing at the top of the staircase, silent, just observing her as she dusted below. She never spoke. But she began to act differently. When she polished the floors near where he played, she moved more slowly, careful not to disrupt his small routines. When she dusted shelves, she would leave his favorite toys slightly crooked, just enough for him to notice and fix, to give him something to control, to own. She started humming softly while cleaning, nothing loud, just enough for him to hear from across the hall. Sometimes she caught him glancing toward the sound. She didn't know if it meant anything, but she hoped it did. It wasn't pity driving her, it was recognition. That same kind of quiet emptiness she had carried for years, she now saw reflected in him. The difference was that she was old enough to hide hers. He wasn't. At night, lying in her narrow bed, Sophia thought of him. She wondered what he dreamed about, whether he remembered his mother's face, whether he even knew what laughter felt like anymore. The next morning, she found herself working in the family lounge again, wiping dust from the piano. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished black surface. When she pressed a key accidentally, the soft note echoed across the empty room. It startled her, but when she turned, she saw Noah standing behind her. He hadn't made a sound coming in. His eyes were curious, not afraid, just quietly studying her. Sophia's heart skipped. She wanted to greet him, but her voice stayed trapped. So instead, she smiled again, the same gentle one as before. Noah didn't return it, but this time he walked a few steps closer. Then, wordlessly, he pressed one of the piano keys. A soft note. Then another. And another. The melody was broken, uneven, but it was something. Sophia stood still, not wanting to ruin the moment. The sound filled the air between them, fragile but alive. When Noah finally turned to leave, he glanced back at her for a brief second, then disappeared down the hallway. Sophia exhaled shakily, realizing her hands were trembling. That night, while eating her dinner of rice and beans at the small table in the laundry area, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The notes, the look, the feeling. Something had changed. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she could feel the silence in that house beginning to shift, like a door unlocking somewhere deep within its walls. And though she didn't dare admit it to herself, she was waiting, hoping for the next time their paths would cross again, because deep down, she knew that one day Noah would speak, not because he was forced to, but because he would want to. Sophia sat on a small wooden stool in the corner of the main kitchen, finishing her lunch after a long morning of cleaning. Her meal was simple: white rice, a few beans, and a small piece of chicken wrapped in foil. The faint smell of roasted garlic and detergent hung in the air. Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows, filling the silence with rhythm. She ate quietly, her back straight, her movements careful. In this house, even the way you chewed felt like it mattered. The rules had taught her that silence was safety. But today she wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw him, the subtle shift in the air, the way her heartbeat changed. Slowly she turned her head. Noah stood in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame, his wide brown eyes fixed on her plate. His small fingers gripped the wood of the door. He looked uncertain, as if debating whether to step forward or vanish. Sophia froze. She didn't know if she was allowed to speak or even acknowledge him. Her throat tightened. Then, in the smallest, softest voice, Noah asked, "Can I eat your leftovers?" The words landed like a spark in the dark. For a second, Sophia thought she had imagined it. Her fork stopped mid-air. The silence stretched, the only sound the rain against glass. Then she looked at him properly and saw it. His lips had moved. His eyes were bright. He was waiting for her to answer. Sophia's breath trembled as a small laugh escaped her, pure and startled. It wasn't the polite kind of laughter she gave the other staff. It was real, honest, warm, the kind that comes from surprise and joy colliding at once. She shook her head gently, still smiling. "You're funny," she whispered. Noah blinked as if surprised by her reaction. For the first time since she'd seen him, a faint curve formed on his lips, an almost smile. It was clumsy and fleeting, but it was real. He didn't run away. He just stood there still, as if the moment itself had anchored him. Sophia wanted to offer him her food, to invite him closer, but she remembered the rule. No talking, no contact, no emotion, so instead she did the smallest thing she could. She slid her plate slightly toward him, her fingers resting beside it. She didn't speak again, and in that silence, something alive filled the space between them. The kitchen, once cold and mechanical, now felt warm, like the first flicker of life returning to a forgotten room. Just then, footsteps echoed from down the hall. Richard Whitmore was walking toward the kitchen, a stack of papers in his hand, his mind busy with numbers and meetings. But then he heard something strange, something out of place. Laughter. He stopped. It wasn't just any sound. It was his son's. He stepped closer, peering through the doorway, and there it was, Noah, standing beside the maid. Sophia was smiling at him, her eyes soft and shining. Noah was smiling back. Richard froze completely. He didn't know how to process what he was seeing. For years, specialists, therapists, and experts had failed to draw out even a word from his son. And now here he was, laughing, not because of therapy, not because of training, but because of a woman who wasn't supposed to even talk to him. Richard's throat tightened. He felt something inside him, something long buried, begin to move. The simple sentence, "Can I eat your leftovers?" echoed in his mind like a thunderclap. It wasn't the words themselves. It was what they meant. Connection. For the first time, his son had reached out to someone. Richard leaned against the doorway, unable to speak. All the rules, all the structure, all the control, what had any of it done? Nothing. But one simple act of kindness had done what he never could. He didn't realize it then, but the foundation of his world was beginning to crack. Sophia, unaware of his presence, continued as if the moment were delicate enough to break with sound. She took a sip of water, wiped her hands quietly, and smiled again when Noah sat cross-legged near the wall, still watching her. "Do you like rice?" she asked softly. He nodded. Beans, too. A tiny smile tugged at his lips. He didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. His eyes said enough. Sophia didn't push the conversation. She just let it breathe. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. And for the first time since she arrived, Sophia felt peace in this house. Noah stayed there until she finished her meal, his presence calm, his gaze steady. She could feel something changing, not just in him, but in herself. Because kindness, she realized, didn't need permission. Meanwhile, Richard slowly stepped back from the doorway, his heart pounding. He walked down the hallway without knowing where he was going. His thoughts scattered. He had spent years believing that control kept his family safe, that silence was protection. But what if silence had been the very thing killing them all along? Inside the kitchen, Noah picked up Sophia's empty plate and placed it neatly on the counter, a small, almost proud gesture. Sophia smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. That was all. No rules broken, no promises made, but for both of them, something irreversible had begun. Richard didn't work that afternoon. He sat in his study, staring out the rain-streaked window, the sentence looping endlessly in his mind. "Can I eat your leftovers?" It wasn't hunger that drove those words. It was longing for attention, for warmth, for love. And though he couldn't admit it aloud, Richard felt something heavy slip from his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stocks, deals, or projects. He was thinking about his son, and about the woman who had somehow reached him when no one else could. He didn't know it yet, but that simple sentence had changed everything. The silence in the Whitmore Estate had finally been broken, and nothing in that house would ever sound the same again. The next morning the house felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if that small spark of laughter had loosened the mansion's grip on silence. Sophia didn't dare mention what had happened in the kitchen, but her heart carried it like a secret flame. For years this house had been a place where warmth was forbidden. Now one small boy had broken the rule simply by smiling, but change never goes unnoticed. Richard called Sophia to his study early that morning. His tone was clipped, his words formal. When she entered, the room was cold, sunlight streaming through tall windows that did nothing to warm it. Richard stood behind his desk, his hands resting on a file. "Sit," he said. Sophia obeyed, her heart pounding. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence was sharp enough to cut through air. "I saw what happened yesterday," he began. "In the kitchen." Her fingers tightened in her lap. "You spoke to my son," he continued, his voice controlled but firm. "You encouraged interaction." Sophia opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She had no defense. What could she say? That the boy had smiled for the first time in years? That a few words of kindness had done more than all his therapists combined? Richard's jaw clenched. "Your job is to clean, nothing more. Do not talk to him again unless absolutely necessary. Do not encourage this kind of closeness." Sophia lowered her gaze. "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was breaking. She had seen something real in Noah's eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. To smother it felt wrong, almost cruel. But she nodded anyway, because arguing wouldn't change anything. Richard dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "That will be all." Sophia stood, turned, and walked out quietly. The heavy door closed, behind her with a soft click, sealing the distance between two people who didn't yet realize they were fighting for the same thing, love, in their own broken ways. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She replayed the scene in her mind again and again. Noah's smile, his small, curious voice, the warmth that had filled the kitchen, and then Richard's cold words. She understood his fear. It wasn't cruelty. It was protection, twisted by loss and guilt. But that didn't make it easier. She whispered to herself in the dark, "I can't unsee his smile." Despite the warning, the next day, Noah found her again. He didn't speak. He didn't even walk close. He just appeared, quiet as a shadow, while she folded towels in the laundry room. He sat on the floor near the doorway, arranging small red and blue blocks into patterns. Sophia pretended not to notice. She kept folding, but her lips curved into a faint smile that she couldn't hide. After a few minutes she said softly, "The red ones look nice." He didn't respond, but he placed another red block carefully on top, his small hands deliberate and steady. It was enough. A silent exchange. Over the next few days, these small moments continued. Noah would appear wherever Sophia worked, by the stairs, near the family lounge, or sitting at the kitchen entrance during her breaks. He never demanded attention. He just wanted to be there. Sophia, cautious but unable to resist, allowed these quiet bonds to grow. She turned small chores into games. When tidying up his toy shelf, she'd whisper, "Let's count how many blue cars we have." Sometimes he'd give her the wrong one on purpose, just to see if she noticed. She would gasp playfully, "That's green, not blue." And he'd hide a smile, pretending not to care. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the words were clearer, braver. "Where do these go?" he asked one morning, holding a stack of books. Sophia pointed toward the shelf. "Top row. You have a good memory." He didn't say anything, but the pride in his eyes was undeniable. For the first time in years, Noah was engaged. Other staff began to notice. They saw the boy walking more freely around the house. They heard faint giggles echoing from the lounge. One of the older maids whispered, "It feels less like a museum now." Sophia said nothing. She didn't want credit. The joy itself was enough. But Richard noticed too. At first he observed from a distance. He would stand in the hallway, half hidden, watching his son's interactions with Sophia. Sometimes he lingered near the study door when he heard Noah laugh, a sound he hadn't heard since Amelia died. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. One afternoon, while passing by the lounge, Richard froze again. Noah was laughing, full, unrestrained laughter, as a tower of toy blocks collapsed. Sophia laughed too, clutching her stomach. The sound filled the air, echoing off marble and glass. Richard felt something deep in his chest twist painfully. That sound, so alive, so normal, pulled him backward in time. He saw Amelia sitting on the floor years ago, clapping as Noah built the same kind of tower. He remembered her voice, soft and teasing. "Again, sweetheart." And he remembered the way that laughter had died the day she did. He turned away, gripping the wall to steady himself. For years he had convinced himself that silence was safety. But watching them now, he wondered, was silence just fear, dressed up as control? That night Richard sat alone in his study, unable to focus on the glowing computer screen in front of him. He could still hear Noah's laughter echoing faintly in his mind. He had spent millions on therapy, private tutors, structured programs. None of it had worked. Yet Sophia, this woman with no degree, no training, no pedigree, had done what all of them could not. She hadn't tried to fix Noah. She had simply seen him. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning. He didn't want to admit it, but for the first time he felt doubt, real, painful doubt. He had built his world around certainty. But now one gentle maid had cracked that foundation. He closed his eyes, hearing her laughter in the kitchen again. It wasn't rebellion, it was healing, and maybe deep down that terrified him most. It was a grey afternoon when the next shift in their lives began. The sky outside the tall windows was heavy with rain, the kind that made the world feel slower, softer. Inside the Whitmore Estate, the house was quiet, except for the distant hum of the storm and the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen. Sophia was standing at the counter, holding a bottle of cleaning solution. She squinted at the small printed instructions on the back, trying to make sense of the letters. The words blurred together, unfamiliar shapes that refused to stay still. She frowned, flipping the bottle over, then back again, hoping the meaning would somehow appear. She didn't notice Noah at first. He stood near the doorway watching her, his small head tilted, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but curiosity. After a moment, his small voice broke the silence. "You don't know how to read." Sophia froze. The bottle nearly slipped from her hands. She turned slowly to face him. Her cheeks burned. She began but stopped. For a moment she thought of lying, of pretending she'd just misread something, but the truth pressed against her chest too heavily to ignore. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Her voice carried the weight of years of hiding, of pretending, of avoiding anything with words on it. Noah didn't laugh. He didn't mock her or look confused. He simply nodded once, then stepped forward. "I can teach you," he said softly, his tone gentle, as if offering her something precious. "Like you teach me how to play." Sophia blinked, caught off guard. The simplicity of his offer undid her completely. Her lips trembled into a small, grateful smile. "Okay," she whispered, and just like that, their lessons began. Noah grabbed a handful of colourful toy blocks, each with a letter carved into its side. He placed them carefully on the floor, A, B, C, D, and pointed with pride. "This is A," he said. Sophia repeated it, her voice uncertain. This one's B." "B," she echoed, then smiled shyly. He grinned, eyes lighting up. "You're good at this," she laughed softly. "You're a good teacher." Noah's chest puffed slightly with pride, and he continued. "C is for car," he said, holding up one of his small toys. Sophia chuckled. "C, car." They continued for nearly an hour, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the maid and the billionaire's son surrounded by toys, letters, and laughter. At first, Sophia felt foolish. She was a grown woman learning from a child, but Noah's patience made her feel at ease. He never corrected her harshly or rushed her. When she stumbled over a sound, he simply smiled and said, "Try again." He was so gentle, so careful, that Sophia began to forget her embarrassment altogether. She started to enjoy it. For years, words had been her weakness. Now, they were becoming her doorway to something new. From the hallway, Richard passed by, intending to return to his study. But he stopped. The faint sound of voices floated through the open door. Noah's soft, deliberate speech, followed by Sophia's laughter. He paused, leaning against the wall. Noah's tone was confident, explaining each letter carefully, and Sophia's voice followed, warm and eager, repeating after him. Richard listened, transfixed. It wasn't the lesson itself that stopped him. It was the tone. Noah sounded alive, engaged, present. He hadn't heard that kind of energy in his son's voice in years. Richard took one slow step closer, just enough to see through the cracked door. There they were, sitting on the floor. Noah pointing at letters, Sophia repeating them, her expression lit with genuine joy. The boy's small fingers traced letters across the blocks, and when Sophia got one right, he clapped. The sound of their laughter hit Richard harder than any business loss ever could. He realized something. Sophia hadn't just taught his son to smile. Now, his son was teaching her to live without shame. It was a partnership, one he couldn't have planned, bought, or controlled. Richard didn't enter. He simply leaned against the wall, eyes glassy, listening to his son's voice fill the house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. After that day, the lessons became routine. Whenever Sophia had a short break, Noah would appear with new tools, a children's book, a cereal box with printed words, or alphabet cards from his old school supplies. Sophia would laugh, saying, "You brought homework again?" Noah would nod proudly. "You said you wanted to learn." Together they practiced. Sometimes she'd hold a small notebook in her lap, writing crooked letters as Noah corrected her softly. Other times they'd trace words in flour spread across the kitchen counter, giggling when the letters came out wrong. Sophia kept every scrap of paper they used. Every A and B she wrote felt like a small victory. Late at night, after finishing her chores, she'd sit in her little room, tracing those letters again in her notebook, whispering their sounds like prayers. Her life, once made up of endless cleaning and silence, was now full of color, letters, laughter, learning. And for Noah, those moments were everything. Teaching her made him feel capable, seen, useful. He wasn't just the quiet boy anymore. He was the teacher. The mansion's energy shifted again. The halls that once echoed with emptiness now carried the gentle rhythm of words being sounded out, syllable by syllable, mistake by mistake. Other staff began to notice the difference. The laughter that drifted through the kitchen no longer startled them. It comforted them. One of the older maids whispered, "I haven't heard the boy talk like that in years." Richard noticed it too. At first it unsettled him, this unfamiliar warmth weaving through his cold, perfect home. But soon he found himself craving it. Every time he passed by that room and heard their voices, something inside him eased. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he was beginning to see. Structure had built his world, but love was rebuilding it, and it all began with letters. Tiny, clumsy, imperfect letters that spelled something neither of them said aloud, but both of them knew: hope. The Whitmore Estate had never been so alive. It started quietly, small sounds, small moments. The gentle hum of Sophia's voice repeating letters, Noah's laughter echoing faintly from the lounge, the rhythmic tap of pencils on the kitchen table. Little by little the mansion's silence began to dissolve, replaced by something warm, human, and unpredictable. The other staff noticed it first. They whispered about it during breaks. The boy who never spoke was now talking every day. The woman who once worked silently now laughed softly as she swept. The air itself felt lighter, as though the house had been holding its breath for years and was finally exhaling. Sophia didn't notice the change at first. She was too focused on Noah's progress. Each day he grew bolder, teaching her new letters, forming small sentences, correcting her gently with a grin. Sometimes, during their lessons, he would glance at her with a look that only children have, pure, trusting, full of quiet affection. It melted her every time. One afternoon, while they were seated at the small kitchen table, Noah proudly drew a big, shaky E across a sheet of paper. "This is E," he said, his voice steady. Sophia clapped softly. "Very good, teacher." Noah puffed out his chest, pretending to be serious. "You're my best student," he declared. She laughed, the sound filling the room like sunlight. From the hallway, Richard stood frozen. He had only meant to pass through, but he found himself unable to move. The sound of Noah's confident voice reached him, along with Sophia's laughter. He pressed a hand to the doorframe, watching through the narrow gap. Sophia's notebook was open on the table, her handwriting awkward but determined. Noah pointed out letters, occasionally making up silly sentences like, "E is for elephant. Who eats eggs?" And she would laugh so hard that she'd nearly fall off her chair. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd seen such joy in this house. He leaned his head slightly against the doorframe, his throat tightening. The scene before him, simple, ordinary, felt like a miracle. It struck him then. His mansion, once an echo chamber of silence, had become something else entirely, a home. He didn't interrupt them. He couldn't. He just listened. Each laugh, each small correction, each try again from Noah felt like a reminder of how much he had missed. Later that evening, Richard sat in his study, the same place where he'd once found comfort in isolation. The reports on his desk blurred before his eyes. He couldn't focus on numbers anymore. Not when his mind was full of voices. Theirs. He reached for a folder on his desk labeled Background Checks. Inside was a file on Sophia Hale. He had requested it weeks ago out of habit. the same way he vetted all his employees. But now, curiosity was something else entirely. He opened it slowly. The report was simple, factual, and quietly devastating. Sophia had lost her mother when she was 10. Her father had abandoned the family soon after. She had raised 4 younger siblings on her own, working odd jobs to survive: laundry, cooking, cleaning. She had never gone back to school. Most employers dismissed her once they realized she couldn't read or write, but she never gave up. She had no record, no complaints, no demands, just a lifetime of quiet perseverance. Richard closed the file, guilt washing over him. He had judged her for being uneducated, for not belonging in his world. Yet she had achieved something no professional ever had. She had given his son a reason to speak, to laugh, to live. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His heart felt heavy, but not with anger, with realization. The walls he'd built around his life weren't protecting him anymore. They were imprisoning him. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Sophia and Noah continued their lessons. Sophia had brought out colored pencils and a small notebook. Noah sat across from her, concentrating as he drew letters across the page in big, uneven strokes. "That's E again," he said proudly, drawing it slower this time. Sophia copied him, her lines crooked but steady. "Like this?" "Better," he said, nodding. "Almost perfect," she laughed. "Almost is good enough for me." They spent nearly an hour like that, writing, laughing, learning. When Noah got tired, Sophia brought him a small glass of juice and a cookie. He split the cookie in half and handed her the bigger piece. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, eyes bright. "You're welcome." It was such a simple act, childlike, pure, but it broke something inside her. For so long, her life had been about giving, her time, her energy, her heart. No one had ever given back, until now. The kitchen, once a place of sterile efficiency, now pulsed with life. The air carried the scent of sugar and pencils, laughter and warmth. The mansion itself seemed to change with them. Curtains stayed open longer. The smell of fresh baking drifted through the halls. Even the other workers began to move with lighter steps. The guards at the gate smiled when Sophia passed. The silence that had once suffocated the place had turned into something softer, a background hum of life returning. Richard noticed the difference everywhere he looked. He saw color where there had been emptiness. He heard joy where there had been structure. And for the first time in years, he let it happen. He didn't interrupt their lessons. He didn't question their laughter. He didn't remind Sophia of her place. Instead, one morning, he quietly left a small box of new pencils and fresh notebooks on the counter. No note, no message. Sophia found them an hour later. She looked around, but no one was there. She smiled quietly, knowing who had left them. That same day, Richard caught himself doing something strange. He paused by the kitchen door, not to scold, not to supervise, but to listen. He heard Noah say, "Today we learn F," and Sophia respond, "Oh no, not another tricky one," followed by laughter. He smiled without realizing it. Something inside him had shifted completely. He still didn't know what to call it, but it felt like peace, and as the days passed, one thing became clear. Sophia Hale hadn't just helped his son, she had saved them both. The afternoon was supposed to be perfect. Richard Whitmore had spent days preparing for the private investor meeting, a formal gathering meant to display not just his wealth, but his control. The estate had been polished to perfection. Chandeliers gleamed, glasses sparkled, and every corner of the mansion had been scrubbed until it shone. Sophia had helped prepare the setup. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon polish as she adjusted the last vase on the dining table. She didn't know much about business, but she knew how to make a room feel alive. By late afternoon, the guests arrived, men in tailored suits, women with diamond smiles. They moved through the marble halls with quiet admiration. Richard led them himself, his confidence restored, his voice smooth and practiced. Everything was going perfectly, until a sound broke the air. Soft laughter. It came from the family lounge. The investors turned their heads, curious. Richard froze mid-sentence. When he followed the sound, his heart dropped. On the carpet near the sofa, Noah was wearing a towel like a cape, pretending to be a knight. Sophia knelt beside him, holding a wooden spoon like a sword. Together, they were acting out a story from a fairy tale book. "Sir Knight," Sophia declared dramatically, making Noah giggle. "You must protect the kingdom." Noah laughed so hard he fell backward, clutching his towel cape, his small face bright with joy. For a fleeting moment, it was beautiful. And then Richard's composure shattered. "What is going on here?" His voice cut through the room like glass breaking. The laughter stopped. The guests fell silent. Noah froze, his tiny hands trembling. Sophia turned, her smile fading instantly. Richard's face was unreadable, but his eyes burned. "This is not a daycare," he said sharply, stepping forward. "You were hired to clean, not to roll on the floor like a clown." The words hit her like a slap. Sophia rose slowly, her face pale. "Sir, Enough." His tone was final, cold, the kind that didn't invite explanation. He turned to the guests, forcing a tight smile. "Please, excuse the interruption." The investors nodded awkwardly, pretending not to have seen anything, though the discomfort hung thick in the air. Sophia lowered her head, her hands trembling. Without another word, she turned and walked out. Behind her, Noah stood frozen, his wide eyes filled with confusion and hurt. His hands clenched the towel like a lifeline. Richard didn't look at him. He couldn't. He returned to the guests, but his voice had lost its steadiness. The rest of the tour passed in uneasy silence. When it was over, the mansion fell still again. Sophia went straight to her small room and locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her trembling hands. Tears fell before she could stop them. She had only wanted to make Noah happy, to help him express himself. And for a moment it had worked. He had laughed freely, without fear, but now that laughter felt like a crime. Her chest ached with shame. She had survived humiliation before, but this felt different. This came from someone she had respected, someone she had begun to believe was changing. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she didn't belong here at all. Down the hall, Noah sat alone on the carpet. The towel had slipped from his shoulders. His toys lay scattered, untouched. His small hands pressed against his ears, his breathing shaky. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring blankly at the floor, his body motionless. The mansion, which had been alive with warmth just hours ago, grew cold again. Later that evening, Richard sat in his study, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. He told himself it was about professionalism, about boundaries, but the truth gnawed at him. The memory of Noah's face, how his laughter had turned to silence, wouldn't leave him. Then came a soft knock on the door. When he opened it, Noah stood there holding a notebook. His small hands shook as he handed it over, then turned to leave without a word. Richard frowned, confused. He looked down at the page. In large, uneven handwriting, it said, "You yelled at my best friend." The words hit him harder than any accusation ever could. He sank into his chair, the notebook trembling in his hands. He had spent his entire life controlling everything, his business, his image, his emotions. But in that single moment, he realized what his control had cost him. He had hurt the one person who had brought his son back to life. The next few days blurred into one long silence. Noah stopped laughing. He stopped talking. The notebook stayed closed, the crayons untouched. Sophia returned to work quietly, her steps heavier than before. She no longer hummed while she cleaned. She avoided the main rooms, staying in the background like a shadow. The other staff felt the change instantly. The air had gone heavy again. The warmth that had filled the mansion had vanished, replaced by the old stillness Richard once thought he wanted. He saw it everywhere, the emptiness he'd created. At dinner, Noah ate silently, eyes down. In the mornings, he passed Sophia in the hall without a word. She wanted to reach out, to fix it, but she couldn't, not after what had happened. Richard tried to speak to his son once. "Noah," he said softly, kneeling beside him. But the boy didn't respond. He just turned away, shoulders tight. It was the same silence Richard had lived with for years. Only now he understood its weight. It wasn't peace. It was punishment. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind order or control. The house had gone back to what it used to be, cold, quiet, hollow. But now Richard knew exactly what was missing, and knowing that made it unbearable. The days that followed were heavy. The Whitmore Estate, once filled with small bursts of laughter, had fallen back into a familiar, unbearable silence. But now that silence didn't comfort Richard. It crushed him. Every corner of the mansion seemed to echo with what he had lost. The faint sound of Sophia's voice teaching letters, Noah's laughter bouncing off the marble floors, all gone. Sophia moved through her chores quietly, her face expressionless, her steps light as if she didn't want to disturb the emptiness. But behind her calm exterior, she was breaking. Every time she passed the family lounge, she saw the towel Noah used as a cape lying untouched in a corner, and her heart clenched. Noah, too, had changed. He no longer sought her out. He avoided her gaze. His little hands stayed busy arranging toys in perfect lines again, the same patterns he used to make before Sophia arrived. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then, barely. It was as if the light had been turned off inside him. Richard saw it all. And every time he did, guilt tightened around his chest like a vice. He wanted to fix it, to speak, to undo what he had done. But he didn't know how. He had built his life around control, around giving orders. But this wasn't something he could command back into existence. One night, he stood outside Sophia's door, unsure whether to knock. For a moment he hesitated. Then he did. The door opened slowly. Sophia stood there, her eyes tired, her face calm but guarded. Before he could speak, she said quietly, "I'm leaving." Richard froze. "Please don't," he said quickly, his voice unsteady. "I've already caused enough trouble." "You haven't," he insisted. "I have." Sophia said nothing, waiting. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I made a mistake. I thought keeping control meant keeping things safe. But I was wrong. I hurt you, and I hurt my son. I'm sorry." The words came out raw, unpolished, but honest. Sophia looked down. She wasn't used to hearing that word, not from men like him. After a long pause, she spoke. "I'll stay," she said softly, "but not just to clean." "I want to do more," Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophia took a deep breath. "There are so many women like me, women who were never given a chance to learn. Maids, cooks, cleaners, all of them stuck in silence. I want to teach them, like Noah teaches me." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes shone with conviction. Even if it's one letter at a time, Richard studied her. For the first time, he saw not just a worker, but a woman with strength, vision, purpose. He nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it." Sophia blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "We'll create something real," he said. "Classes, a program, whatever it takes." She smiled faintly. "Not for me," she whispered, "for everyone who needs it." Richard's voice softened. "For everyone," he agreed. That conversation became the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. In the days that followed, Richard set aside his business projects and began working on something different, something that mattered. He reached out to local educators and charities looking for guidance. He used his resources not to expand his empire, but to open doors for others. He called it New Pages. The idea was simple but powerful, a literacy initiative for women in domestic work. Free classes, free materials, transportation, even small stipends so they wouldn't have to choose between learning and surviving. Sophia helped him build it from the ground up. She sat at the long dining table every night, helping plan lessons, reviewing simple materials, and suggesting ways to make learning less intimidating. She poured her heart into it, and through it all, Noah watched. He saw his father and Sophia working side by side, their conversations softer now, their voices steady. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. One afternoon, while Sophia was packing supplies into a box for the first batch of students, Noah appeared in the doorway. She turned, startled. He hesitated, then ran toward her and wrapped his arms tightly around her waist. Sophia froze for a second, then dropped to her knees and hugged him back, tears welling in her eyes. "I missed you," she whispered. Noah nodded against her shoulder. "Me too." From the doorway, Richard stood watching. He didn't speak. He just let the moment unfold. That single embrace said everything words couldn't. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was healing. From that day forward, things began to change again, but this time deliberately. The silence didn't just fade. It was replaced with purpose. Sophia returned to her duties, but her presence carried a new kind of energy. She smiled more. She taught more. She even began reading short notes aloud during breaks, testing the words Noah had helped her learn. Richard, too, changed in quiet ways. He started spending less time in his study and more time in the kitchen or the garden. He asked the staff about their families. He listened. The mansion felt lighter, as if someone had opened all the windows and let the world back in. And every evening, when Sophia and Noah sat at the table practicing letters, Richard would occasionally join them, just to watch, to listen, to learn what love actually looked like when it wasn't buried under control. For the first time in years, the Whitmore Estate wasn't just a home of wealth, it was a home of change. Noah laughed again. Sophia smiled freely. Richard breathed without guilt, and somewhere between the letters on Sophia's notebook and the echoes of Noah's laughter, something new had been written into their lives, something no one could erase. Months passed, and the Whitmore Estate continued to evolve. The house that once held only echoes of loneliness now carried the sounds of life, footsteps, laughter, and conversation. But the change didn't stop at the mansion's walls. Richard had been working quietly, methodically, on something greater. The lessons he had learned within his own home had become the blueprint for something much larger. And finally, the day came. The large event hall downtown gleamed with warm lights and soft music. Rows of chairs filled the space, occupied by journalists, teachers, community leaders, and women from every corner of New Haven, maids, nannies, cleaners, all dressed in their best clothes. A banner stretched across the stage, the Whitmore Foundation for Inclusion and Literacy. Backstage, Richard adjusted his tie nervously. For a man who had faced boardrooms and business rivals without flinching, this felt different. This mattered. Beside him stood Sophia Hale, dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress. Her hair was tied neatly, her face glowing with quiet pride. She looked nothing like the shy maid who had once stood trembling at the mansion gates. Today, she was the foundation's integration coordinator, a woman who had fought for her place and earned it. In the front row, Noah sat proudly with a small notebook clutched in his hands. His legs swung slightly as he waited. When the lights dimmed, the murmurs faded. The host stepped forward to introduce the event, and moments later, Richard walked to the podium. He looked out over the crowd, taking a deep breath. The room fell silent. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. The Whitmore Foundation exists for one purpose: to give back what the world too often takes away. Opportunity. He paused, eyes glancing briefly towards Sophia. "I once believed that structure and control were enough," he continued. "That order was love. I was wrong. It took a woman with no degree, no power, and no reason to trust me to teach me that human connection is more powerful than any system. She reminded me that learning begins not with words, but with kindness. The audience listened intently. Richard's gaze found Noah in the front row, clutching his paper. He smiled softly. "And now, someone very special would like to say a few words." The crowd murmured with curiosity as Noah rose from his chair. Sophia knelt beside him, straightening his small tie, whispering, "You've got this." He nodded seriously, then walked onto the stage. The microphone stood tall, but a small stool had been placed for him. He climbed up, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. The audience waited. Noah began reading, his voice soft but clear. "This place helps people learn," he said carefully. "My friend Sophia helped me learn too. Now I'm happy. I love her." The hall went silent for half a second, then erupted in applause. Some people stood, clapping through tears. Sophia covered her mouth, trying to hold back her sobs. Richard blinked rapidly, struggling to keep his composure. When Noah finished, Sophia joined him on stage. She knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You were amazing." The boy beamed, gripping her hand. Later in the program, Sophia was invited to speak. The spotlight followed her as she stood before the microphone. For a moment she hesitated, then began. "I grew up believing that my voice didn't matter," she said, "that people like me were meant to serve quietly in the background. But one day a little boy asked me a question, a simple one, and everything changed." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "He taught me to read. He taught me to believe that learning has no age, no class, no boundary. And now I want to help others believe it too." The room was silent except for the occasional sniffle. "I want to study teaching," she added, her voice trembling with hope, "so that one day I can help others find their voice the way I found mine." The applause that followed was thunderous. When the crowd finally quieted, Richard returned to the microphone. But this time his words were personal. "I once thought that feelings were distractions," he said. "That emotion made people weak. But I've learned that compassion doesn't weaken us. It makes us whole. My son didn't need perfection. He needed to be understood, and I didn't know how to do that. Until Sophia came into our lives." He turned to her with a genuine smile. "She helped my son feel, and she helped me live." The audience stood, applauding again. Longer this time. Flashbulbs went off, capturing the moment. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was proof that transformation was real. After the event, guests approached Sophia, shaking her hand, thanking her. She smiled shyly each time, overwhelmed but proud. Noah tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering, "Can we go home now?" She laughed softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's go home." Richard joined them, resting a hand on Noah's shoulder as they walked out together. The drive home was quiet. Not the cold kind of quiet, but a peaceful one, filled with unspoken warmth. When they reached the Whitmore Estate, the kitchen lights were still on. They stepped inside, exhausted but happy. Noah climbed onto a chair, looked at the table, then turned toward Sophia with a mischievous grin. "I want to eat your leftovers again," he said. Sophia froze, then burst into laughter, pure, bright, and uncontrollable. Richard leaned against the counter, smiling helplessly as Noah giggled beside her. That single sentence, the same one that had started it all, now carried the weight of everything they'd been through. It wasn't just a question anymore. It was a memory, a bond, a symbol of love that had rewritten their lives. Sophia served dinner, sliding a plate toward Noah. "There you go, my little knight," she said playfully. He laughed. "And you're the queen." Richard sat down with them, unfolding his napkin. "Then what does that make me?" Sophia grinned, the man who finally learned to listen. They all laughed together, the sound echoing through the house like music. As they ate, the room felt full of light, of warmth, of family The mansion that had once been a monument to grief was now alive again. Every wall, every corner, every breath carried the story of what they had built together. It had started with a plate of rice and beans, with an innocent question, and it ended here, with love, laughter, and a home reborn. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. If you stayed till now, thank you for being part of this journey. Stories like this remind us that kindness can rewrite lives, even in the quietest corners. Tell me in the comments, what part touched you the most? Which moment stayed with you? I read every single one, and your thoughts truly matter. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and of course, subscribe for more stories that speak straight to the heart. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing in small miracles.